You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 314, The Great Seal. Now, we last looked in on the Continental Congress in episode 307, just after the victory at Yorktown. Congress received the victorious General Washington, and it also began pushing off most of its work to executive secretaries, particularly the Secretary of Treasury, Robert Morris. Even so, Congress found itself in an ever-increasingly precarious position. With the war coming to an end, the states found it less important than ever to work together or to support the Army financially. Congress had kept the government on life support, mostly by receiving financial assistance from France, but with North America becoming less important to the French war effort, and with the French government's finances straining as well, Congress could not rely on much more help from that source. So, in early 1782, Congress decided to focus on another pressing issue, approving the country's official seal. The use of seals was an ancient practice, predating a time when most people could read or write. A leader would place a seal on an official document to show that that document had the authority of law. While there was no necessity to have a seal, members of Congress thought it was an important tradition to maintain for the new nation. The process of designing a seal ended up taking many years. Congress first looked at the idea in 1776. It appointed a committee of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson to work on a design. Each member of the committee suggested his own design. Franklin wanted an image of Moses standing over the divided Red Sea and drowning the Pharaoh. His suggested motto was, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." Jefferson suggested another biblical scene with the children of Israel being led through the wilderness by a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night. On the reverse, Jefferson suggested images of Hengist and Horsa, the two brothers who supposedly led the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain in the 5th century. Adams wanted a reproduction of an Italian painting known as the Judgment of Hercules, where the hero had to choose between a path of self-indulgence or a more difficult path of honor and duty to others. After none of their ideas seemed to gather a consensus, and they all seemed to lack any good understanding of heraldry, the committee sought the help of a French artist living in Philadelphia, Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière. His proposal included the symbols of the 6 European nations that had populated North America, with a female representing liberty on one side and a soldier on the other side. Above them was the Eye of Providence in a triangle, and below was the motto E pluribus unum, Latin for out of many, one. The committee reported their various suggestions to Congress. The delegates generally seemed to prefer the du Cimetière design, with a few modifications. This included removing the soldier and adding a second lady justice holding a sword. They also simply added the wording, Seal of the United States of America, with 1776 written out in Roman numerals. Even with their suggested changes, Congress decided they were not impressed with the final choice, and they tabled the matter. So they forgot about the seal for about 4 years until 1780, when Congress appointed a second committee to consider a new design. The members this time were James Lovell, John Moran Scott, and William Churchill Houston. The second committee members did not each try to come up with their own designs. Instead, they consulted with Francis Hopkinson, a former delegate who was serving on the Admiralty Court of Pennsylvania at the time. Hopkinson is credited with designing the U.S. flag in 1777 and also working with du Cimetière to design a seal for the state of New Jersey. For the Great Seal, Hopkinson proposed a shield with 13 red and white diagonal stripes. Above them would be a constellation of 13 stars. Standing on one side would be an Indian warrior holding a bow and arrows. On the other side was a woman holding an olive branch. The motto would be Bello vel pace apparatus, meaning prepared for war or peace. On the reverse side, it had a woman seated in a chair holding an olive branch and a staff topped by a liberty cap. The motto, Virtute Perennis, means everlasting because of virtue, and it also had the Roman numerals 1776 written across the bottom. After discussions with the committee, Hopkinson removed the Indian, replacing him with a soldier, and they also shortened the motto to Bello Vel Pace, simply for war or peace. The committee then presented the version to Congress. Once again, Congress failed to approve the proposed seal and just let the matter sit. 2 more years passed until May of 1782, when Congress appointed a third committee to revisit the issue. Congress initially appointed John Rutledge, Arthur Middleton, and Elias Boudinot to the committee, although Arthur Lee replaced Rutledge at some point. Once again, the committee relied on an outside consultant. This time, William Barton took up the challenge. Barton came from a prestigious Philadelphia family. The young man had recently begun a career as a lawyer, and importantly for this job, he had studied heraldry in England for several years before returning to Philadelphia in 1779. Barton's initial suggestion of a rooster was rejected by the committee. His second design showed a shield with 13 red and white stripes broken up by a torch. The shield was surrounded by a blue border with 13 white stars. On one side was a maiden holding a dove, and on the other side was a soldier. Above the shield was a helmet, and above that was an eagle. The motto, written above all that, was Vindicium Libertatis, in defense of liberty, and below, Virtus Sola Invicta, only virtue unconquered. For the reverse, Barton suggested a pyramid of 13 steps, and above the pyramid was the Eye of Providence. The mottos, Deo Favente, with God favoring, and Perennis, everlasting. The pyramid design was taken from one that Francis Hopkinson had designed earlier and was currently being used on the $50 Continental note. Once again, Congress reviewed the suggestions, but once again did not give final approval. This time, it turned over the results of all 3 committees to Charles Thomson, the Secretary of Congress. They asked Thomson to come up with a final proposal based on the work of all 3 earlier committees. Thomson took Barton's eagle, and it made that the main element on the front side. The eagle had a shield on his chest with 13 red and white stripes. It also clasped an olive branch in one talon and a bundle of arrows in the other. A ribbon containing the motto, E Pluribus Unum, was displayed on a ribbon above the eagle. Above that was a circle with a blue field containing 13 white stars. For the reverse side, Thomson used Barton's design of the 13-step pyramid, adding a triangle around the Eye of Providence and changing the mottos to Annuit Coptis Novus Ordo Seclorum. He favors New World Order. Thomson submitted his proposals to Congress on June 20th, 1782. Now, he didn't actually give them an actual design, he just provided them with a written description. Nevertheless, Congress approved his suggestions that same day. Thomson had a brass die cut over the summer, and the new seal saw its first use on September 16th, when Thomson used the seal on an authorization to General Washington to negotiate an exchange of prisoners. But Thomson would continue to use the seal on various documents until 1789, when the newly elected President Washington asked him to transfer it to the Department of Foreign Affairs, which later became the Department of State. The seal would continue to be used for diplomatic documents. Aside from getting the seal finalized, there were some other issues that Congress focused on during this time. When London sent General Guy Carleton to take command of British forces in America, the new government hoped that he might be able to work out a peaceful compromise with the Americans that might end the war quickly and not necessarily with a total separation. Carleton quickly discovered that there was little to no chance of that. The Asgill affair had soured relations between the two sides, but even without that, there was little chance that the U.S. would do anything that prevented its goal of complete independence. The Americans were also honor-bound to remain in the war until Britain also came to peace terms with France. Carleton did find one issue that might provide Britain with an opening. The independent Republic of Vermont had been in existence for 4 years by this time. Congress still refused to recognize it, knowing that doing so probably caused New York to break away from the Union. Vermont, of course, was getting very frustrated by all of this. In 1781, Vermont considered expanding its borders to several towns in New York and New Hampshire that expressed a desire to become a part of Vermont. Since New York and New Hampshire did not recognize Vermont's sovereignty, the Green Mountain State saw little need to respect the sovereignty of New York and New Hampshire. If there was a potential border war with its neighbors, then expanding its borders gave Vermont a better chance of defending itself. Vermont also entered into negotiations with General Haldimand in Quebec, who sought to drive a wedge into the Patriot cause by discussing British support for Vermont's sovereignty. Seeing this as a threat, Congress once again brought up the idea of recognizing Vermont as the 14th state. In early 1782, a majority of 7 states were ready to do this. Under the Articles of Confederation, such a measure would require 9 states. 2 of those states that were still in that minority, New York and New Hampshire, would have to acquiesce in some way, even if Congress got to those 9 votes. Several of the other states also recognized that there were other separatist movements within their states that might cause future problems. Virginia and North Carolina were particularly concerned about such movements in their own western lands. They did not want to set a precedent that Congress could simply divide up states without the consent of the state being divided. By the spring of 1782, the controversy had at least subsided. So while this still was a festering issue, Congress ended up doing nothing of consequence and just let the issue linger. Overall, though, finances remain the biggest problem. If peace did come soon, Congress was not sure how the Army might react to being disbanded without pay. If peace did not come soon, Congress was not sure how it could afford to keep an army in the field. News of the loss of the French Navy at the Battle of the Saints made clear that they would be getting no further support from the French Navy. Minister Luzerne, the French ambassador in Philadelphia, informed Congress that not only was King Louis unlikely to send any money or much of anything else, the king also noted that he would no longer pay to support the American diplomats in Paris. He requested also that Congress give Minister Benjamin Franklin the power to start settling accounts in France for all the past loans that France had given to America during the war. Congress for years had no money and no power to collect money. Its loans from Europe were drying up and the collectors were starting to come knocking. Congress embarked on a begging campaign, sending 2 ministers, Joseph Montgomery of Pennsylvania and Jesse Root of Connecticut, to visit state legislatures in New England and pass the collection plate. They also sent John Rutledge of South Carolina and George Clymer of Pennsylvania to put pressure on the southern states. The delegates hoped that this in-person appeal might have better luck at collecting some money. It did not. The efforts fell flat, collecting only enough payments to cover about 1 day's worth of government expenses. Even the delegates personally were broke. They had no money to pay themselves either. One member of Congress, John Witherspoon, wrote to a friend around this time that he had to leave Congress because he could no longer support his own expenses in attending it. So, of course, like Americans today, when you're dead broke, deep in debt, and you see no way out, there's only one thing you can do. Throw a raging kick-ass party. Yes, they decided to throw a massive blowout party in Philadelphia. Minister Luzerne saw the American cause as stumbling, with both France and due to its own inability to fund the war. He believed that the leaders needed a morale boost to show the world that France and Americans were still close allies. The excuse he found was the birth of the Dauphin. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette welcomed their first child into the world in October of 1781. Now, this was a big deal in France because the king and queen had been married for 11 years without producing a child. In America, where monarchy was not really something to be celebrated anymore, Congress had passed a resolution in May congratulating the king on his impressive act of procreation, but then they just kind of moved on to other things. Luzerne, however, latched onto the event as an excuse to throw a massive party in Philadelphia to celebrate the King of France. He sent out more than 1,000 invitations to officers, politicians, and prominent citizens all around Philadelphia and beyond. Generals Washington and Rochambeau were, of course, among the invitees. Luzerne built a pavilion next to his house on Chestnut Street. He put Captain Charles L'Enfant in charge of designing the pavilion and the area around it. Years later, L'Enfant would be called on to design the entire city of Washington, D.C. Luzerne's party got Philadelphia to close the surrounding streets to traffic on July 15th so that the party could spill out into the streets. And it was good that they did so because more than 10,000 Philadelphians turned out just to watch the party from the streets. Music welcomed the guests, who danced into the evening. At 9 p.m., the music paused so everyone could enjoy a display of fireworks. The banquet began at midnight, and the champagne flowed freely. The party finally broke up a little before dawn as everyone made their way home. A few people questioned the propriety of throwing a lavish party when money was so tight, but Luzerne had funded the party with his own private finances, which he was, of course, allowed to do. Several questioned whether a republic should be celebrating the continuation of a monarchy, but overall it proved to the world that America was still closely allied with France and that Britain would not succeed in its attempts to divide that alliance. Now, another first for the summer took place in the Army. Military commendations in this era were pretty rare. Officers would occasionally receive some token of appreciation in the form of maybe a sword or a coin struck for a particular victory. It was almost never that enlisted men were recognized with anything more than an extra ration of rum or a kind word. General Washington sought to change that. He recognized that many men had served through the many difficult years of the war and had really not received any special recognition. The enlisted soldiers who had sacrificed so much for their country deserved to receive recognition. As part of his general orders on August 7th, Washington announced that, quote, honorary badges of distinction are to be conferred on the veteran non-commissioned officers and soldiers of the Army who have served more than 3 years with bravery, fidelity, and good conduct. For this purpose, a narrow piece of white cloth of an angular form is to be fixed onto the left arm of the uniform coats. Non-commissioned officers and soldiers who have served with equal reputation for more than 6 years are to be distinguished by 2 pieces of cloth set on parallel to each other in a similar form. Washington then added in his orders, should any who are not entitled to these honors have the insolence to assume the badges of them, they shall be severely punished. On the other hand, it is expected those gallant men who are thus designated will, on all occasions, be treated with particular confidence and consideration. These white badges were permitted simply based on length of service. But there were also soldiers who merited special notice, so Washington's orders continued. The general, ever desirous to cherish the virtuous ambition in his soldiers, as well as to foster and encourage every species of military merit, directs that whenever any singularly meritorious action is performed, the author of it shall be permitted to wear on his facings over the left breast a figure of a heart in purple cloth or silk, edged with narrow lace or binding, and not only instances of unusual gallantry, but also of extraordinary fidelity and essential service in any way shall merit with a due reward. Before this favor can be conferred on any man, the particular fact or facts on which it is to be grounded must be set forth to the commander-in-chief, accompanied with certificates from the commanding officers of the regiment and brigade to which the candidate for reward belonged, or other incontestable proofs, and upon granting it, the name and regiment of the person with the action so certified are to be enrolled in the Book of Merit, which will be kept at the orderly office. Men who have merited this last distinction shall be suffered to pass all guards and sentinels which officers are permitted to do. The first recipient of this Purple Heart was Sergeant Elijah Churchill of the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons. Churchill had led a raid on Long Island that previous fall using whaleboats to defeat a superior force, capturing 300 prisoners and destroying enemy supplies. The second recipient was Sergeant William Brown, who was part of a forlorn hope at Yorktown. He and his men pushed into the British redoubt just before the main army under Colonel Alexander Hamilton charged. Their goal was to sow confusion among the defenders. and all of them expected to die. Brown was badly wounded, but it in fact managed to survive. The third recipient, Sergeant Daniel Bissell, was a Continental soldier who deserted in 1781 and joined the British in New York. There he served under General Benedict Arnold. Now, unbeknownst to almost everyone, Bissell had done this in an effort to serve as a spy for General Washington, a role that he performed for more than a year. Now, as far as we know, these were the only 3 Purple Heart Awards that were given out during the American Revolution. But that award, of course, is remembered in the military to this day. Next week, we're going to head south for the British evacuation of Savannah, Georgia. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and the Sons of the American Revolution. And you can check out the Sons of the American Revolution podcast at fastfunhistory.com. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe and TJ Walker, and to Jamie Brown for his return to the Privy Council on Patreon. I really do appreciate everyone who has supported this podcast financially, either through a continuing contribution on Patreon or a one-time donation via PayPal or Venmo. Also, a quick reminder, it's getting to be t-shirt weather again. I want to remind everyone that you can get an American Revolution Podcast t-shirt at my virtual storefront on TeePublic. I've created a variety of shirts, some of which have the podcast logo, others are just images from the Revolutionary War itself. I am also happy to make customized logos, so if you want something that you don't see there, just let me know what you would like, and I'll see if I can put it together for you. You can find links to my storefront on TeePublic at the bottom of each blog episode and in the notes for each podcast episode. Also, I noticed that TeePublic has recently begun producing hats, so if you'd rather have an American Revolution Podcast hat instead of a shirt, be sure to check those out as well. Today we discuss the Great Seal that Congress adopted in 1782. It's largely remained the same ever since. It appears on many official documents, including proclamations and treaties. It's also on all U.S. passports. And of course, the most common place to see it today is on the back of the $1 bill. The original seal remains in the custody of the U.S. State Department. The Purple Heart never really caught on after its introduction in the American Revolution. For starters, it wasn't called the Purple Heart at the time. It was called the Badge of Military Merit. It was also a patch, not a medal. It was cut out in the shape of a heart. It was purple. Most people forgot about it, though, after its initial use. The U.S. Army and Navy did not issue any real decorations until the Civil War, when it established the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, that medal was given out much more liberally than it is today. In fact, after the war, the government tried to claw back from many of the soldiers who had been awarded it because they tightened their requirements for receiving the medal. In World War I, U.S. soldiers noted that other countries had different decorations for varying levels of merit. The Army and Navy began awarding the Distinguished Service Cross for valor that didn't quite rise to the level of the Medal of Honor. It also awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, which could be awarded to non-combatant actions. In World War II, the military added the Silver Star and the Bronze Star for actions that were not quite up to the level of the Distinguished Service Cross. The Purple Heart came into use again between World War I and World War II. In 1932, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, introduced it for meritorious service, but it also added the restriction that its award required being wounded. It could be awarded to officers and enlisted men alike, and MacArthur just called it the Purple Heart. Now, despite the differences from the original, MacArthur was very much aware of the association with Washington, and he introduced the new medal on February 22, 1932, the bicentennial of George Washington's birth. The first recipient of this new Purple Heart was Douglas MacArthur. The general requested one for gas injuries that he had received during World War I. The award was retroactive as long as the soldier was still alive. Some veterans of the Civil War applied for and received the new Purple Heart. Since its inception, more than 1.5 million servicemen and women have received the Purple Heart. There have been some slight changes to the Purple Heart over the years. It can now be awarded posthumously, but it has become one of the most widely recognized medals given out by the armed services. My book recommendation this week is The Eagle and the Shield by Richard Patterson. This book was first published in 1978 by the State Department. The author, Richard Patterson, was a longtime employee of the State Department, and he died just before publication of this book, and the actual final work of the book was completed by Richardson Dougal. The book itself, for such a particular topic, is pretty lengthy, at over 600 pages, all devoted to the Great Seal. The book is no longer in print, and it's one of the few books I've found that you cannot buy on Amazon, even as a used book. There is, however, a copy of it on archive.org, and since it's a publication of the federal government, there's no copyright. So you can read it online, download a PDF, copy it onto your Kindle, whatever you want, no charge. This is the most thorough book on the topic of the seal that you'll find anywhere. So if that interests you, check out The Eagle and the Shield by Richard Patterson. My online recommendation this week is a website which is simply called greatseal.com. It provides great information about the seal and its history. There are lots of great pictures on the site. Many of them are historical pictures and drawings of proposed early versions of the seal. A lot of those I've already put on my blog, but if you want the complete originals, you can go there to see them. It's pretty much everything you'll want to know about the development and use of the Great Seal. If you want to check that out, just go to greatseal.com. Of course, I've included links to both the book and the online recommendation on my blog and website. Now, my question this week asks, did the American Revolution establish any rights for women? Well, I guess I have to say no. The American Revolution really broke new ground in establishing that there were basic human rights for all. That is, that government could not infringe on certain basic things. The Revolution used language about inalienable rights and universal rights. Of course, they were doing this in a world that recognized none of that. Some may point to the British Magna Carta as the beginning of the establishment of rule of law, but that document was mostly establishing rights for aristocrats against the king. It was not a document of universal rights. The founders grew up in a world where your place in society was governed by your birth. No one expected equal treatment or certain basic rights to be universally applied. That was the revolutionary point of the revolution. And while the revolution certainly was a leap forward in setting new goals for society, it didn't always do very well in reaching all those goals immediately. One of the most glaring failures that lots of people have brought up, and I've discussed before, was slavery, which really seems incompatible with the idea of universal freedom. The revolution saw the beginning of a real abolition movement, but it would take just over 77 years for that movement to reach its goals. Women's rights took even longer. It was almost universally accepted that women could not vote. New Jersey recognized the right of women to vote for a very short time during this period, but also very quickly revoked that right. Married women also could not own property and could not inherit property under common law. There were many other limitations that would be shocking to modern sensibilities, but considered perfectly normal at that time. All of this was part of a larger view that women were not mentally or emotionally suited to the affairs of politics or business. It would take many more generations to prove that mindset wrong. The most famous women's advocate at the time was probably Abigail Adams, who famously wrote a letter in early 1776 to her husband to, quote, "remember the ladies." In her letter, Abigail referenced the nearly unlimited power that husbands had over wives, no different from the tyranny of Britain over the colonies. John's response essentially laughed off Abigail's request. Whether he agreed in principle or not, introducing the larger issue of women's rights into the independence movement would have only divided the men that he was still trying to form into a coalition against Britain. It would take time for this to change. In 1848, New York became the first state that granted married women the right to own their own property and to keep their own pay as their personal property separate from their husbands. It would take another 50 years for all states to adopt similar legislation. The right to vote took even longer. Following New Jersey's short experiment, women could not vote anywhere in the U.S. until Wyoming passed such a law in 1869. It only became possible nationwide in 1920 after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So, as with many rights, the American Revolution set us on a path, but it would take many more generations of fighting to realize the aspirations of those founding principles. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.